Hi, I'm Joe Miller, anatomy teacher for YogaRenew, and in this video we're going to be looking at the anatomy of sun salutations. So I'm joined today by Alex, who's very kindly agreed to come in and help me out to demonstrate some of these poses. So my hope is with this video, if you're a yoga teacher, that you'll have a little bit better understanding of the anatomy of sun salutations, which of course is a very common sequence that are used in many yoga classes. And I also hope to give you some very specific cues that you'll be able to put into place to help your students have a better experience in their sun salutations. So we're going to begin with Tadasana. So we'll stand up, and Alex, I'll just have you face this way just to start with. So one, I think, kind of common misconception that students have when they hear the idea that we are standing with the feet hips width apart in Tadasana is to think that the hips, that means the outsides of the hips. Right? But in fact, when we talk about hips width in asana, what we're really talking about is the distance between the hip joints. So what I'm going to have Alex do is just place her fingers in her hip creases, and if she just kind of bends her knees and sits her hips back a little bit, she's kind of finding that place where she's feeling where the fold is actually happening, where the forward bend is really happening at the hips. That's where the hip joints are. So if she stands up again, and she keeps her fingers where the hip joints are, you can see they're actually several inches farther in from the side of the hips. So when she's standing with her feet hips width apart, we want to draw a vertical line from the hip joints down through the heels and into the ground. Okay, thanks. So Alex, why don't you face toward the front of the mat? The next thing that I'd like to talk about is the first movement of a sun salutation, which is bringing the arms overhead. So we often will get the instruction to take the arms out to the side and overhead. So you can bring your hands down just for a second, Alex. So taking the arms out to the side means that you would be moving in what we call the frontal plane. This is a movement, it's called abduction of the arms. And if you bring the arms back down for just a second, Alex, so that's perfectly fine to move through the frontal plane, and many students will be able to do that very easily. But I found in my experience, sometimes students may struggle a little bit with that, or they feel like, oh, it feels like that's not the easiest pathway to bring the arms up, or maybe they feel like, oh, there's a little catch in there. So if your students are having that experience, you might think about moving through what we call the plane of the scapula. So the scapula is the shoulder blade. The shoulder blade is actually where the shoulder socket is. And of course, the shoulder blades are resting on the rib cage. The ribs are not flat, the ribs are rounded, which means that when the shoulder blades are resting on the rib cage, they actually have to kind of conform to that rounded shape. So what that means is that the shoulder sockets don't face directly out to the side. Or in anatomical terms, they're not really kind of pointing straight out in that frontal plane. They're actually angled forward a little bit to that frontal plane, in a plane that we call the scapular plane. So if Alex were to turn her palms out and bring the arms just a little bit forward, not straight forward, but a little bit forward and out to the side, kind of finding that scapular plane, she can see whether that kind of moving through that plane feels like maybe it's a little freer or a little more unobstructed. So now there's actually, of course, lots of different ways of bringing the arms up. Another way you might think about moving through that plane would be if you had your hands in prayer in front of your heart. This actually, of course, makes your arms a shorter lever. In a way, it kind of makes them lighter. But also, you'll see that as Alex brings her arms up from this position, her arms are actually still a little bit more forward rather than straight out to the side. So it's another way to kind of find that scapular plane. All right, thanks so much, Alex. So as you inhale, let's bring the arms out and up. All right, that's perfect. And then exhale, fold forward. So Alex will fold forward into Uttanasana, standing forward fold. So in this pose, the hips are what we call flexed, which just means you're bent at your hips. The spine is also flexed. In fact, if Alex lets her head relax, we can really see that her spine is kind of making this very beautiful, long, even curve all the way from the tailbone to her head, if we want to kind of think of her head as being part of her spine. So in Uttanasana, the hips and the spine are flexed. Now, the next movement in Sun Salutation A is what we often refer to as a flat back. And I think sometimes students have some kind of misunderstanding of what that means. Like, they might think, oh, flat back means I need to make my back flat or parallel to the floor. So let's say if you were to do that, Alex, if you were to come up even a little higher, like you were really parallel to the floor. So students might think, oh, that's what flat back means. That's not really what we mean when we say a flat back. And fold forward again. Sometimes, of course, maybe we'll cue it as halfway lift. That's another way of thinking about it. But again, that doesn't really quite get at what we're doing in flat back. What we're really doing is we're keeping the hips flexed. So if we look at the angle of Alex's pelvis, I'm actually just going to place this block here on her sacrum, which is the back of her pelvis. We can see that angle. When she moves into a flat back, she's really just going to extend her spine, but her pelvis isn't really going to move. So she's keeping her hips flexed, she's just extending her spine. And then she'll fold forward again. Now, Alex, of course, is very flexible in her hamstrings, very easy for her to keep her fingers on the floor while she's doing that. But many students are probably going to find they actually do need to come up a little bit higher to really find that flat back. So in terms of cueing, I often like to cue this by saying something like, as you inhale, extend your spine, or inhale, lengthen your chest away from your pelvis. So something along those lines, rather than saying kind of flat back, just to reduce that confusion. Great. Okay, so let's do it one more time, Alex. You can fold forward into Uttanasana, and then as you inhale, extend your spine, lengthening your chest out of your hips, and then again, exhale and fold forward. All right, thanks. All right, the next pose that we'll look at is Chaturanga, everybody's favorite. I'm not going to make Alex stay in Chaturanga the whole time while I'm talking, but I will have her come into plank pose. So a cue that I like to use in Chaturanga is to visualize that you are pushing the floor away with your hands as you lower. So you're not simply giving into gravity, but almost like you're actively pushing the ground away as you come down. So let's just have a look at that, Alex. Beautiful. Okay, and then back to plank and take a little breather for a moment. One of the reasons why I think that cue is really useful is that it helps to activate some important muscles around the shoulders. So there are muscles here in front of the shoulder blades on the sides of the rib cage. They're called the serratus anterior muscles. They're very important muscles for stabilizing the shoulder blades onto the rib cage. Also the triceps muscles on the backs of the arms, those muscles are working to resist gravity as we lower. So if we think we're pushing the ground away and we continue to push the ground away as we lower to Chaturanga, we're going to really activate those muscles. Beautiful. Thank you, Alex. Why don't you take a little breather in child's pose for a moment. Take a little break for a moment. Okay, the next pose we're going to look at is upward facing dog. And an issue that I sometimes find students have with this pose is that when they're coming into it from Chaturanga, is they'll kind of push forward over their toes and wind up in a position where the shoulders are out in front of the wrists. And you can see if Alex does that, do you see how the angle at her wrist is a little bit more than 90 degrees? And then go back to down dog for a moment, Alex. Now, of course, wrists are strong, resilient joints. Doesn't mean your wrist can't bend past 90 degrees. We do that when we're coming into handstand or crow pose. But some students may find that the more that they bend the wrist past 90 degrees, the more that they're feeling a little bit of sense of stress in the wrist. So if that's the case, what I usually suggest to those students is, as they come forward into plank, they lower to Chaturanga, they step over their toes and bring the toes back a little bit. Do you see how now Alex has a little longer wheelbase? Her shoulders land on top of her wrists, less of an extreme angle at her wrists, and then back into downward facing dog. And I should probably just make one more little anatomical distinction about that position of the wrists. You might think in Chaturanga or a plank or in down dog, you might think to yourself, oh, the wrists are flexed. And in fact, I said wrists bent because that is actually what flexed means. But technically, your wrists are actually extended in this position. So just so that we're clear on that. Okay, how you doing, Alex? All right, good. Okay, so let's have a look at downward facing dog. I think sometimes students have an idea that in downward facing dog, they must get the heels down to the ground. And that's because we get the instruction to press the heels toward the floor. Now that is, I'm not saying that's not part of the pose, right? We are in fact trying to lengthen the heels down and lengthen the sitting bones up. Doesn't mean that we can't bend the knees in downward facing dog. And for many students, that might actually be more helpful for them. You see if Alex bends her knees, Alex, I'm just going to help to draw your hips back just a little bit. If Alex bends her knees, it might actually help her to find a little more lift of her pelvis. But I know Alex can do downward facing dog with her knees straight. So as she straightens her knees, she'll lengthen her heels down and her sitting bones up. But if we have the idea that, oh, we've got to get the heels down on the ground, then Alex, if she's a student, she might think, well, I could do that. I'll just walk my feet up a little bit. The more you walk your feet up, though, the more the tendency is for the back to round, to lose that length of the spine that we're looking for. So rather than doing that, I'd rather have Alex walk her feet back a little bit, even if her heels are not on the ground. The other thing that I do sometimes see students doing when they're trying to press their heels toward the floor is they wind up collapsing in the arches. So if you find your students are doing that, a good cue you can use is to ask them to lift their heels a little bit. This actually puts a little stretch on what we call the plantar fascia on the sole of the foot, and it will actually help to lift the arches. We'll give them that experience of the arches lifting. And then, can they lengthen the heels down while keeping the arches lifting and keeping the sitting bones lifting high? All right, thanks, Alex. Why don't you take a break? Thanks again to Alex for demoing for me today. I hope this video was helpful for you. If you're a yoga teacher, I hope that it gave you some ideas about ways that you might cue this very, very common sequence that we do in so many yoga classes a little bit more effectively for your students. I hope also it gave you some ideas about ways that you might be able to modify these poses for your students if they're experiencing any kind of difficulty or challenges in this sequence. If you're interested in learning more about anatomy and anatomy for yoga, please check out my yoga anatomy courses at YogaRenewTeacherTraining.com. Those courses will give you the tools that you need as a teacher to be able to sequence your classes better, to cue your students more effectively, and to be able to tailor your teaching to your students' individual needs to help to make you a more confident, knowledgeable, and valuable teacher. Okay, thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.